In the quiet halls of Asgard, where golden light moves like honey through ancient corridors, there lived a god whose very presence made the world softer. His name was Baldur, and to speak it was like whispering the first word of morning. The light that surrounded Baldur was not the harsh brilliance of lightning, nor the scorching fire of the sun. Instead, it was the gentle radiance that filters through leaves in summer, warm and welcoming, like the glow that lingers just after sunset. Those who saw him felt their worries grow lighter, their hearts slower, their breathing deeper. Baldur was the son of Odin, the All-Father who gathered wisdom like others gather flowers, and of Frigg, whose love flowed like the gentlest river through all the 9 realms. Their child had inherited the best of both, his father's depth and his mother's endless tenderness. In this god of light and purity, the Norse people saw their highest hopes reflected, not as blinding perfection, but as the quiet contentment that comes when all is well with the world. And for a time, a long and peaceful time, all was indeed well. The halls of Asgard had never known such serenity. When Baldur walked through them, his footsteps made no sound, yet somehow the very stones seemed to sigh with contentment. The other gods would pause in their conversations, not from interruption, but from the simple pleasure of being in his presence, and the night grew softer around his light. But even in paradise, shadows can fall, not harsh and sudden, but like the gradual dimming of day into twilight. Baldur began to dream, and his dreams were unlike any the gods had known. These were not the prophetic visions that sometimes visited his father, nor the warrior dreams of Valhalla. Baldur's dreams came like mist, soft and pervasive, carrying whispers of endings that felt both distant and inevitable. In his sleep, he saw himself fading like the last light of winter, not in violence, but in a gentle dissolution that left the world somehow emptier. Night after night, the dreams returned. Each time they were a little clearer, a little more real. Baldur would wake with the feeling that something precious was slipping away, like water through cupped hands. The light around him remained as warm as ever, but now it carried the bittersweet quality of autumn afternoons. Frigg, his mother, noticed first. A mother's heart is tuned to the subtlest changes in her child, and she heard in Baldur's voice a note that hadn't been there before. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of wistful knowing. "Tell me your dreams, my light," she said one evening as they walked together through gardens where every flower bloomed eternal. The words came from Baldur like a gentle confession, each dream described in the soft tones one uses to speak of beautiful, fragile things. And as the dreams were shared, they seemed to lose some of their weight, dispersing into the evening air like dandelion seeds on a summer breeze. But the questions they left behind settled quietly in Frigg's heart. What did it mean when the most beloved of gods dreamed of ending? The story rested here for a moment, gathering its breath. Love, when it moves with true purpose, can reshape the very fabric of the world. Frigg's love for Baldur was like this, not possessive or desperate, but steady and encompassing, like the pull of the earth itself. She began a journey unlike any taken before, not through distant lands or across treacherous seas, but through the web of connections that bound all things. Her mission was simple in its speaking, vast in its undertaking, to ask every being, every object, every force in all the 9 realms, to swear an oath never to harm her son. The first to pledge were the elements themselves. Fire promised to burn around Baldur, but never consume him. Water vowed to flow past him like a gentle stream. The winds agreed to carry him softly, never to buffet or break. Even the storms, those wild children of the sky, gave their word to grow calm in his presence. The stones and mountains, those ancient witnesses to the world's long history, who had stood silent through countless ages of change and transformation, who had watched the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of species, the slow dance of geological time that measured change not in years but in millennia, added their voices to the chorus of protection with the slow dignity of beings who measured time in geological ages rather than passing seasons. The mightiest peaks promised to stand firm against any force that might threaten him, their snow-covered summits serving as watchtowers from which any danger could be spotted leagues away, their massive bulk providing shelter and protection from weather that might otherwise prove challenging. These ancient mountains, whose stones held memories of the world's first days, whose foundations reached deep into the planet's core, swore to use their stability in service of maintaining his safety. Rocky cliffs promised to crumble into gentle slopes before his feet, if the terrain he needed to traverse proved too challenging for comfortable passage. Treacherous scree, those loose collections of broken stone that could shift unexpectedly and cause even the most sure-footed traveler to lose their balance, swore to compact itself into safe paths that would support his weight reliably and provide secure footing regardless of conditions. Caves throughout all the realms would open their depths as shelters if he needed rest, their darkness becoming warm and welcoming rather than cold and forbidding, their atmospheres adjusting to provide the kind of environment that would refresh rather than oppress, that would offer true respite rather than mere temporary protection from external conditions. Even the deepest caverns, those spaces that had never known sunlight, promised to glow gently when he entered, their walls emanating a soft radiance that would complement his own light without competing with it. Even the hardest granite and the sharpest flint promised to grow smooth and rounded in his presence, ensuring that no sharp edge might ever cut his skin, no pointed projection might ever snag his clothing, no rough surface might ever cause him discomfort or inconvenience. The minerals that formed the bones of the world itself would restructure their crystalline arrangements when he approached, eliminating any possibility that their natural hardness might accidentally become a source of harm. Precious stones and gems, those crystalline formations that had grown in the earth's depths under conditions of tremendous pressure and heat, adding their own beauty to Frigg's comprehensive campaign. Diamonds promised to shine more brilliantly in his presence, their light reflecting and amplifying his radiance. Emeralds swore to deepen their green hues when he was near, their color becoming more vivid and beautiful. Rubies committed to glowing more warmly, their red depths catching his light and returning it with enhanced beauty. But beyond their ornamental promises, these precious stones also swore never to become projectiles that might be hurled at him, never to be set in weapons that might be used against him, never to become part of any device or mechanism that might cause him harm. Their beauty would remain purely beneficial, their value would serve only to honor him, their presence would bring only pleasure and delight. The very concept of geology seemed to reorient itself around his protection, as if the earth sciences had suddenly discovered their highest purpose in service to one whose nature was so completely harmonious with the stability and patience that characterized the planet's deepest foundations. Erosion would work in his favor, wearing away obstacles rather than creating them. Sedimentation would build up supports where he needed them rather than barriers that might impede his movement. Even the forces of volcanic activity, those dramatic expressions of the Earth's internal heat and pressure, promised to moderate their intensity when he was in their vicinity. Lava would flow around rather than toward him, its molten rock finding alternate routes that would not endanger his passage. Volcanic gases would disperse harmlessly rather than creating toxic atmospheres that might affect his breathing. The very core of the planet seemed to commit itself to his welfare, its vast energies redirected toward protection rather than potential threat. Next came the creatures of the world, beings whose lives were measured in different scales of time, whose perspectives on existence varied according to their species, their environments, their particular roles in the vast web of ecological relationships that connected all living things. From the mightiest whale to the smallest insect, from the fiercest predator to the gentlest grazer, all added their voices to the growing symphony of oaths with enthusiasm that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere obligation. The wolves, despite their fierce nature and their ancient reputation as symbols of wilderness and freedom, as creatures who bowed to no authority save their own pack loyalty and hunting instincts, promised to guard rather than hunt when Baldur was present. Their yellow eyes would watch over him in the forests, their keen senses alert for dangers he might not perceive, their powerful legs ready to carry warnings faster than any other messenger. Their howls would become songs of protection rather than calls to pursuit, their voices raised in harmonies that would comfort rather than intimidate. The great serpents, those ancient children of chaos who had wrapped themselves around the roots of the world tree and slumbered in the deepest places of the earth, who embodied the primal forces that existed before order had imposed itself on the raw materials of creation, swore to slither past without striking. Their venom would lose its potency in his presence, becoming harmless liquid that could not poison. Their coils would loosen rather than constrict if they accidentally encountered him, their powerful muscles relaxing into gentle curves that could provide support rather than restraint. Their hypnotic gazes, normally used to paralyze prey before striking, would become gentle and contemplative rather than predatory when directed toward him. These ancient beings, whose wisdom came from eons of patient observation and whose knowledge encompassed secrets that younger creatures could not comprehend, offered their protection with the weight of geological time behind their commitment. Eagles, those proud monarchs of the sky who served as messengers to the gods themselves, whose keen eyes could spot movement from distances that defied comprehension, whose powerful wings could carry them to heights that touched the roof of the world, pledged to soar overhead as protectors rather than predators. Their sharp talons,
normally used for grasping prey with crushing force, would never rake his skin with their razored points. Their powerful beaks, designed for tearing flesh, would never be turned against one whose nature was so completely opposed to violence. Instead, these majestic birds would use their superior vantage point to watch for any threats that might approach from afar, their cries serving as early warning systems rather than hunting calls. Their keen intelligence would be devoted to his protection, their aerial reconnaissance providing information about conditions and dangers that ground-based observation might miss. Bears, those powerful lords of the forest whose strength was legendary throughout all the realms, whose massive forms commanded respect from all other creatures, whose claws could rend stone and whose jaws could crush the strongest bones, promised to lumber past in peaceful acknowledgement whenever they encountered him. Their great paws, normally capable of delivering blows that could fell trees, would step carefully to avoid even the smallest discomfort to one so beloved. Their deep growls would become gentle rumblings of contentment rather than warnings of potential aggression, their massive presence serving as deterrent to any other creatures that might pose threats. The great cats, those elegant predators whose grace and power had made them symbols of both beauty and danger throughout the cultures of all realms, whose hunting skills were unsurpassed in the animal kingdom, swore to purr rather than roar in his presence. Their hunting instincts would lie dormant when faced with one whose nature was so completely opposed to predation, their usual alertness for weakness or vulnerability replaced by recognition of strength that required no demonstration, beauty that needed no conquest. Their claws would remain permanently sheathed when he was near, their movements becoming playful rather than stalking, their interactions with him marked by the kind of affection they normally reserved only for their own cubs or mates. These proud hunters, whose independence was legendary, whose submission to any authority was unthinkable, found themselves eager to offer service to one whose gentleness awakened protective instincts they had never known they possessed. Even the smallest creatures joined this comprehensive chorus of protection with their own distinctive contributions, proving that size had no relationship to the importance of the commitment being made, that the tiniest beings could offer gifts as valuable as those provided by the mightiest. Bees, those industrious workers whose complex social organization had made them symbols of cooperation and productivity, promised that their stings would never pierce his skin, though they would continue to make honey for his table with even greater dedication than before. Their work songs would become more musical when he was near, their buzzing taking on harmonious qualities that would add to the symphony of natural sounds that surrounded him wherever he went. Their hives would produce nectar with flavors that existed nowhere else in the 9 realms, sweetness that could only be created by insects whose work was motivated by genuine affection rather than mere instinct. Spiders, those master weavers whose intricate constructions demonstrated engineering skills that surpassed the abilities of much larger creatures, swore that their webs would part like silk curtains before him, never entangling his movement or creating obstacles in his path. Instead of being barriers, their constructions would become works of art for his appreciation, patterns of dewdrop jeweled beauty that would catch morning light in ways designed specifically to delight his eyes. Their silk would be freely given for any purpose that might serve his needs, their spinning abilities devoted to creating beauty rather than traps, their patience and skill redirected toward celebration rather than predation. These creatures, normally solitary and territorial, found themselves eager to collaborate in ways that would honor one whose presence brought harmony to environments that had never known such peace. Wasps, typically aggressive defenders of their territories whose stings were feared throughout the natural world, committed to building their nests away from his paths, their territorial instincts overruled by recognition of his special nature and the inappropriateness of subjecting such gentleness to their normally fierce protection of boundaries. When they encountered him unexpectedly, their aggressive buzzing would transform into musical humming, their normally threatening formations becoming aerial dances performed purely for his entertainment. Hornets, those larger and more formidable relatives of wasps whose presence usually signified danger to any creature unfortunate enough to disturb their colonies, promised to dance in the air around him like living jewels rather than weapons. Their movements would create patterns of beauty rather than displays of menace, their flight becoming celebration rather than warning, their very existence in his vicinity serving as enhancement of his natural radiance rather than potential threat to his well-being. Even the creatures that dwelled in caves and deep places, animals that had never seen Baldur's light directly but had somehow learned of his nature through the mysterious communications that flow between all living things, seemed to understand what had been lost to the world above and offered their own forms of protection and service.
Bats, those nocturnal mammals whose domain was darkness and whose navigation skills defied ordinary understanding, emerged from their caverns in broad daylight for the first time in memory, hanging from tree branches with their wings wrapped around themselves like mourning shrouds, their presence serving as testimony to the universal nature of the grief that his loss had created. Cave-dwelling fish, blind species that had evolved in eternal darkness, swam closer to the surface than they had ever been known to venture, as if trying to reach toward the absent light that had warmed the upper world. The creatures of the sea, those beings who inhabited the vast underwater realms that covered so much of the world's surface, that contained more space and harbored more life than all the terrestrial environments combined, added their voices to the growing promise with the kind of wholehearted enthusiasm that spoke of genuine understanding of what was at stake. Whales, those gentle giants whose songs could travel across entire ocean basins, whose intelligence rivaled that of any land-dwelling creature, whose lifespans allowed them to accumulate wisdom across centuries of experience, would sing him lullabies from the deep if he ever ventured onto the waters they called home. Their massive forms would create calm seas wherever he chose to sail, their movements through the water generating currents that would carry his vessel safely rather than challenging its stability. Their songs would take on new themes when performed for his benefit, melodies that had never existed before in their ancient repertoire, compositions that drew upon their deepest understanding of beauty and harmony to create music worthy of one who embodied both qualities in their purest forms. These ocean dwellers, whose domain was so different from his terrestrial home, nonetheless recognized in him something that transcended environmental boundaries, something that spoke to the essential nature of consciousness itself. Fish of every size and type, from the tiniest specimens that darted through shallow tide pools to the largest predators of the deep oceans, promised to swim in formations that would delight rather than alarm if he should observe them from above the surface or venture into their underwater realm. Their schools would create living kaleidoscopes beneath the waves, patterns of movement and color that would shift and flow in response to his presence, underwater dances performed by thousands of participants moving in perfect coordination. Even the most predatory sharks, those apex predators whose presence struck fear into all other ocean dwellers, whose fearsome reputations had made them symbols of maritime danger throughout the cultures of every seafaring people, would bare their teeth in greeting rather than aggression when they encountered him. Their powerful jaws would open in displays of respect rather than threat, their razor-sharp teeth catching whatever light filtered down through the water in patterns that would sparkle rather than menace. And as this vast campaign of protection neared what seemed to be its completion, as promises had been gathered from every category of existence that Frigg could identify, as oaths had been sworn by representatives of every force and phenomenon that possessed even the theoretical capacity to cause harm, the universe itself seemed to pause in recognition of what was being accomplished. Never before in the history of creation had such a comprehensive conspiracy of protection been organized. Never before had love moved so systematically through all the realms of existence, gathering allies from every possible source, binding all of creation in agreements that transcended normal categories of relationship and obligation. The very concept of harm began to seem foreign in a universe where every force, every being, every object had committed itself to protection rather than destruction when it came to the interaction with one specific individual. It was as if the fundamental nature of reality itself was being renegotiated, rewritten to ensure that at least one perfect being could exist in perfect safety, insulated from all the dangers that normally made existence precarious for even the mightiest of creatures. The magnitude of what Frigg had accomplished was almost beyond comprehension. She had achieved something that no being had ever attempted before. She had negotiated a treaty of peace between her son and the entirety of creation, had organized the universe itself into a vast protective embrace that would shield her beloved child from every conceivable form of harm. The catalogue of her achievement was staggering in its completeness and overwhelming in its implications. Fire would not burn Baldur, water would not drown him, wind would not dash him against obstacles, earth would not swallow him, metal would not cut him, poison would not sicken him, disease would not weaken him, no creature great or small would offer him harm, no force of nature would turn against him, no accident of circumstance would place him in jeopardy, no weapon forged by any hand would find its mark upon his flesh. Every element had sworn its protection, every animal had pledged its service, every plant had committed its assistance, every mineral had promised its cooperation. The very laws of physics seemed to have been persuaded to make exceptions in his case, the fundamental forces that governed reality agreeing to moderate their effects when applied to one whose nature was so completely harmonious with the creative principles of existence. As word of the success spread through the divine community, as the gods learned of the unprecedented protection that now surrounded their beloved brother, the dreams that had troubled Baldur's sleep began to lose their power over his unconscious mind. The visions of fading and dissolution that had disturbed his rest grew fainter and less frequent, replaced by a deep sense of security that seemed to emanate from the universe itself, a cosmic assurance that he was truly safe, genuinely protected, absolutely insulated from all the forces that might normally threaten even divine beings. The quality of his light, which had taken on those poignant undertones of transience and impending change, began to return to its original character, warm and steady and eternal, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from being completely secure in one's place in the cosmic order. His conversations lost their undertones of preparation and farewell, returning to the easy references to future plans and distant possibilities that had always characterized his speech. The other gods, who had grown subtly tense with concern they had not fully acknowledged even to themselves, found their anxieties dissolving like morning mist before the warming sun. The cosmic order that had felt somehow unstable, somehow threatened by possibilities too vague to name but too persistent to ignore, settled back into the kind of harmony that made existence seem not just possible but wonderful, not just bearable but actively joyful. But in the vastness of creation, in the countless multitudes of beings and things, one small oversight can change everything, not through malice or grand design, but simply through the gentle forgetfulness that comes when a task is so large it seems impossible to complete. There was a plant, small, humble, growing not in the proud forests or mighty mountains, but clinging quietly to the sacred oak trees. The mistletoe, with its pale berries and unassuming leaves, seemed so insignificant that it barely registered in the great catalogue of creation. Surely something so small, so powerless, posed no threat to a god. Frigg passed by without asking for its oath, her attention drawn to greater, more obvious dangers. The mistletoe continued its quiet existence, neither harmful nor helpful, simply living its small life among the branches. This was not a dramatic oversight born of arrogance or neglect. It was the kind of gentle omission that happens when one is overwhelmed by the immensity of love itself. A mother trying to protect her child from an entire universe of possibilities might miss the smallest thread in the vast tapestry, and so the great work was completed, or seemed to be. Every oath had been taken, every promise made. Baldur was safe, wrapped in the love and protection of all creation. The dreams of fading began to lose their power, replaced by a deep sense of security that spread through Asgard like warm honey. The gods celebrated not with wild revelry, but with quiet joy, the kind of contentment that comes when fear finally releases its hold, allowing peace to flow in like a gentle tide. And for a time the story rested in this happiness. Safety, when it is complete, breeds its own kind of play. The gods, relieved and joyful, began to create games around Baldur's newfound invulnerability, not from cruelty, but from the simple pleasure of seeing promises kept. They would take turns throwing objects at him, stones that bounced harmlessly away, arrows that curved aside mid-flight, spears that turned to flower petals upon contact. Each test was gentle, more celebration than trial, and Baldur would stand in the center of their circle, laughing with quiet delight as the world kept its word. The sight brought joy to all who witnessed it. Here was proof that love could indeed conquer all, that a mother's devotion could rewrite the laws of nature. The games became a kind of meditation, a peaceful ritual that reminded everyone present of the power of compassion. But watching from the edges, always watching, was one whose heart had grown twisted with complexities that even the gods didn't fully understand. Loki, the shapeshifter, the boundary walker, the one whose nature was to find cracks in every perfect thing. Loki's thoughts were not simple jealousy or pure malice. They were more complicated, like water that finds its way through the smallest gaps not from intention but from its very nature. He saw the joy of the gods and felt separate from it, saw their certainty and wondered what it might feel like to prove that nothing was ever truly certain. The questions began small in Loki's mind, quiet wonderings that grew like seeds in dark soil. What if the protection wasn't complete? What if something had been missed? Not from a desire to harm, but from that deeper impulse to test the boundaries of every truth. And in the growing shadows of doubt, a different kind of game began to take shape. Among all the gods who delighted in the games of Baldur's protection, one stood apart, not by choice but by the cruel gift of darkness that had claimed his sight. Hoder, Baldur's own brother, could hear the laughter and joy but could not participate in the throwing games that brought such happiness to others. Hoder's blindness was not a thing of tragedy in the usual sense, for he had found ways to move through the world with grace and wisdom. But in these moments, when all the other gods took turns celebrating Baldur's safety, he felt the weight of his limitation like a gentle sadness pressing against his heart. "Why do you not join us, brother?" Baldur had asked one evening, his voice soft with concern. The question held no judgment, only love, but it highlighted the gulf that Hother felt between himself and the joyful games. "I cannot see to aim," Hother replied simply, and in those words lay a deeper longing, not just to participate, but to share in the proof of his brother's safety, to feel the satisfaction of watching his throw turn harmless upon contact. This conversation reached other ears, carried on the evening air to one who was always listening, always calculating. Loki heard in Hother's quiet sadness an opportunity, not for grand evil, but for one of those small interventions that could shift the course of everything. Loki's approach to Hother was gentle, friendly, like the offer of help from one friend to another. "I could guide your hand," he suggested with seeming kindness. "You could join the games, feel the joy of seeing through touch that your brother is safe." The offer seemed innocent, even compassionate. What harm could there be in helping a blind god participate in celebration? The kindness in Loki's voice was real, even if the deeper currents beneath it were more complex than simple friendship, and so an agreement was reached, quiet and small, like so many agreements that changed the world. In the deep woods where the sacred oak trees grew, Loki walked alone, his eyes scanning not for grand treasures or mighty weapons, but for something far more humble. His search was patient, methodical, like someone looking for exactly the right stone to skip across still water. He found what he sought growing quietly on an ancient oak, a sprig of mistletoe, its pale berries catching the filtered sunlight like tiny moons. With careful hands he harvested it, not roughly but with the gentle attention one might give to cutting flowers for a beloved. The mistletoe felt ordinary in his hands, neither heavy like a sword nor sharp like an arrow. It was simply itself, a small piece of a small plant that had never made any grand promises to anyone. In its innocence, it held a power that all the mighty weapons of the gods had surrendered. Loki's fingers worked with quiet skill, shaping the humble plant into the form of a dart, not crude or hurried, but crafted with the kind of care artisan might give to their finest work. The irony was not lost on him, that the greatest power might come from the smallest, most overlooked source. As he worked, the forest around him seemed to hold its breath. The trees stood silent, the animals grew still, as if all of nature sensed that something significant was taking shape, though what that might be remained hidden in the space between one moment and the next. When the work was complete, Loki held in his hands something that looked like nothing more than a simple dart whittled from plant matter. No runes of power marked it, no divine fire blazed along its length. It was in every visible way, utterly unremarkable. And perhaps that was exactly what made it extraordinary. The gods had gathered again for their gentle games, the air filled with laughter and the soft sounds of harmless impacts. Baldur stood in the center of their circle, glowing with his characteristic warm light, surrounded by the visible proof of all creation's love for him. Hother stood at the edge of the gathering, and this time he was not alone. Loki had positioned himself quietly beside the blind god, his presence steady and reassuring. In his hand, concealed from the other's view, was the small dart of mistletoe. "Come," Loki said softly, "let me guide you so you too can join in honoring your brother." His voice carried the warmth of friendship, the kindness of one who notices another's exclusion and seeks to remedy it. The other gods smiled to see this consideration, this reaching out to include Hother in their celebration. It seemed so natural, so right, that the shapeshifter would think to help the one who had been unable to participate. Loki placed the dart in Hother's hand, such a small thing, light as a whisper, insignificant as a falling leaf. "Aim where I guide," he whispered, positioning Hother's arm with gentle precision. The moment stretched like honey flowing from a spoon. Around them the other gods continued their joyful throws and laughter, unaware that anything had changed. Baldur stood patient and smiling, ready to demonstrate once again that love had made him invulnerable. Hother's arm drew back, guided by Loki's careful touch. The dart of mistletoe felt natural in his grip, like any of the harmless objects the others had thrown. There was no sense of weight or significance, no premonition of change, and in that space between one breath and the next, between intention and action, the story balanced on the edge of everything it had been and everything it was about to become. What happened next occurred not with drama or thunder, not with the clash of cosmic forces or the screaming of rent reality, but with the quiet finality of a candle going out, of a song ending, of a gentle breeze finally stilling to perfect calm. The dart flew true, guided by Loki's aim and released by Hother's innocent hand, and found its mark as surely as water finds the sea, as naturally as dawn follows night. Baldur felt the impact as a small surprise, not pain, for pain was something his protected body had forgotten how to experience, but rather a gentle discontinuity, like stepping where one expected solid ground and finding instead empty air. For just a moment, he looked down at the modest dart that had somehow penetrated the universal shield of love surrounding him, his expression more curious than alarmed, more puzzled than afraid. The mistletoe dart, having completed its impossible journey, stood embedded in the god of light like a humble flower planted in divine soil. It looked absurdly small against his radiant form, insignificant as a single grain of sand on an endless beach, ordinary as a fallen leaf among countless others. Yet around it something fundamental was beginning to change. Baldur's light, that warm and constant radiance that had illuminated countless days and comforted countless hearts, began to dim with the gradual inevitability of sunset approaching too quickly. It was not the violent extinguishing of flame by wind, nor the sudden darkness of storm clouds covering the sun, but something gentler and more final, the slow fading of embers dying in a hearth where no one remained to tend the fire. He fell without sound, without struggle, without the dramatic collapse that one might expect from the death of gods. Instead, he settled to the ground as softly as snow, as gently as flower petals released by a summer breeze, as quietly as a weary traveler finally lying down to rest. His body found the floor of the great hall with the same grace that had marked all his movements in life, even this final one touched with the dignity that had always characterized his divine nature. For a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, a single heartbeat that contained entire lifetimes of disbelief, a pause in time that held within it the weight of cosmic change, no one moved. The silence was complete and profound, deeper than the hush that falls over the world when the first snowflake of winter touches the earth, more absolute than the quiet that follows the last note of a perfect song. The other gods stood frozen in a tableau of incomprehension, their minds struggling to process what their eyes were showing them, their hearts refusing to accept what their divine senses confirmed. This could not be happening. This was impossible. Every force in creation had sworn to protect Baldur. Every being had given its oath to ensure his safety. Every object had promised to turn harmless rather than cause him harm. Yet here he lay, the most beloved of all gods, brought low by something so small and humble that most of them could barely see it in the dimming light of his fading radiance. The irony was almost too vast to comprehend, that one who was protected by everything should be harmed by the one thing that had been overlooked, that universal love should be defeated by such a tiny gap in its embrace. Then came the sound that would echo through all the 9 realms for ages to come, carrying its weight of loss to every corner of creation, not a scream of anguish or a howl of rage, but something deeper and more terrible, the quiet keening of divine hearts breaking. It began with Frigg, who rushed to her son's side with the desperate speed of a mother, whose protective instincts have suddenly awakened to their failure. Her hands trembled as she touched Baldur's face, finding the skin still warm but growing cooler with each passing moment, the familiar features unchanged but somehow emptier, as if something essential had departed and left only the beautiful shell behind. Her fingers traced the contours of his cheek with the desperate tenderness of someone trying to memorize what is already being lost, trying to hold on to what can no longer be held. "My light," she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely a breath, yet carrying in its gentleness all the weight of a mother's love confronting its ultimate defeat. "My beautiful light." The warmth that had always emanated from Baldur like a constant blessing began to cool, his divine radiance dimming like stars fading before the approach of dawn. But this was a dawn that would bring no new light, only the gray emptiness of a world suddenly bereft of something it had never known it needed until it was gone. The very air around his fallen form grew thinner, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath in disbelief, as if the physical world was struggling to accept that such a fundamental change had occurred in the cosmic order. The golden light that had always filled the great hall began to dim in sympathy, shadows creeping in from corners that had never known darkness. One by one, the other gods began to move, approaching the center of their circle with the careful steps of those who fear what they will find when they arrive. Thor's mighty hammer fell from nerveless fingers, clanging against the floor with a sound like thunder that brought no storm. Freyja's hand flew to her throat as if to hold in a cry that must not be released. Even Odin, who had seen the rise and fall of ages, stood transfixed by the sight of his son lying still and silent on the stones of Asgard. Hother remained motionless in his throwing position, his face a mask of confusion slowly transforming into horror as the sounds around him, the terrible silence where there should have been laughter, the soft sounds of approaching footsteps, the quiet keening of divine grief, painted a picture that his mind refused to accept. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper carried on air that seemed suddenly too thick to breathe. "What have I done? What has happened? I don't understand." The games are always safe. Nothing ever causes harm. What has gone wrong? The questions fell into the gathering silence like stones dropped into a deep well, disappearing without echo into the growing weight of collective realization. Around him, he could hear the soft sounds of gods gathering around his brother's fallen form, could sense the terrible stillness where there should have been movement, could feel the absence of that warm presence that had been as constant as sunrise. The other gods began to gather around their fallen brother, their faces reflecting the same impossible truth that their minds were struggling to process. Baldur, the most beloved among them, the one protected by all of creation, the god whose safety had been guaranteed by the very universe itself, lay still and silent on the grass-woven floor of their divine hall. His light continued its gradual fading, like a sunset that would never be followed by dawn, like the last embers of a fire that had warmed countless hearts now cooling to ash. The radiance that had been as much a part of him as breath or heartbeat was leaving, taking with it something that none of them had realized could ever be lost. Frigg remained kneeling beside her son, her hands never ceasing their gentle touch, as if her love alone might somehow call back what was departing. Her voice began to rise in the ancient lament of mothers throughout all the realms, a sound that spoke not of rage or blame but of pure loss, of love that had tried everything and found it insufficient. And Loki stepped quietly back into the shadows, his expression unreadable, carrying within himself the weight of knowledge that only he possessed in that moment of universal grief. His face showed neither triumph nor regret, neither satisfaction nor sorrow, but something more complex, the look of one who has proven a point he never truly wanted to prove, who has found answers to questions he now wished he had never asked. The hall that had so recently rung with laughter and joy was now filled with a silence so profound it seemed to have weight, pressing down on the gathered gods like the atmosphere of some alien world where happiness had never learned to exist. The very stones seemed to absorb the light, the tapestries appeared to fade, and the flowers that had bloomed eternal suddenly looked fragile and temporary. In the distance, as if carried on winds that blew from every corner of creation, came the first stirrings of response from the wider universe. The elements that had promised protection began to keen their own laments. Winds sighing through empty spaces, water weeping into streams that had never known salt, fire dimming in sympathy throughout all the realms. The animals that had sworn oaths of safety began to howl and cry in voices that spoke of cosmic order disrupted, of promises that had been kept too late, of protection that had failed despite all good intentions. Birds fell silent in forests that had never known quiet, and even the mightiest creatures felt the universe tremble around the fact of Baldur's impossible death. The very fabric of reality seemed to shiver and adjust, recalibrating itself around the new truth that even perfect protection could be defeated by perfect innocence, that love, no matter how complete, could never account for every possibility in an infinite universe. And in that adjustment, in that cosmic recognition of fundamental change, the first seeds were planted of the long twilight that would eventually claim not just Baldur, but the entire world of the gods. The death of the most beloved had torn a hole in the pattern of existence, and through that hole, darker possibilities began to seep like water through a crack in a dam that had seemed eternally strong. The discovery of what had killed Baldur came slowly, like dawn breaking over a world that no longer wanted light. When the gods found the small dart of mistletoe still lying where it had fallen after completing its impossible work, the truth settled over them with the weight of stones. "Mistletoe," whispered one of the gods, turning the insignificant plant over in his hands. Such a small thing, such a humble plant, to have accomplished what all the weapons of war could not. The irony cut deeper than any blade. Frigg's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the hollowness of a mother's ultimate failure. I did not think to ask its oath. It seemed so small, so powerless. Her words trailed off into the kind of silence that follows the recognition of irreversible mistakes. The questioning began gently at first, soft inquiries about how Hothar had come to throw that particular object, how he had known where to aim. The blind god answered with growing confusion and dawning horror, his words painting a picture of guidance received, of helpful hands positioning his throw. And slowly, inevitably, all eyes turned to Loki, who had grown very quiet, very still, like a person trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. The accusation, when it came, was not shouted or screamed. It fell instead like a judgment rendered by the universe itself, spoken in tones of terrible certainty. "You knew. You guided him. You planned this." Loki's response was complex, like everything about him, neither full confession nor complete denial, but something more nuanced and troubling. "I gave him the chance to participate. I helped him join your games. How could I know that one small plant, But the gods had moved beyond the need for explanations or justifications. The time for words was ending, replaced by the heavier silence of action needed. And in that silence, the true weight of loss began to settle over Asgard like snow that would never melt. In the realm of Hell, that vast kingdom that stretched beyond the reach of the living, beyond the boundaries of ordinary geography, beyond the normal laws that govern space and time and the relationship between being and non-being, where the honored dead dwelt in halls that mirrored but did not match the golden splendor of Asgard, Baldur's arrival brought a change unlike any seen since the foundation of that shadow realm, unlike any transformation witnessed since the first soul had crossed the threshold from life to whatever lay beyond life. The journey from death to the halls of hell was not one that could be mapped by ordinary travelers, not a path that appeared on any chart created by mortal cartographers or divine scholars, not a route that followed the normal principles of geography or physics or any of the sciences that attempted to understand the structure of reality. It was instead a journey that followed routes that existed more in the realm of necessity than geography, more in the space of spiritual transition than physical movement, more in the dimension of meaning than in the ordinary three-dimensional space that contained most experiences. It was a path that the soul knew instinctively, like salmon knowing the way upstream to their spawning grounds, like birds understanding the routes of migration without ever having flown them before, like water finding its level without conscious calculation or deliberate planning. The journey was guided by currents that flowed deeper than rivers, more ancient than the roads carved by mortal feet, more fundamental than any form of transportation that depended on the normal relationship between distance and travel, between effort and arrival, between departure and destination. Baldur walked this way with the same gentle dignity he had shown in life, though now his footsteps left no impression on the shadow paths that wound through territories that existed in the spaces between reality and dream, between memory and possibility, between what had been and what might yet be. His breath made no mist in the cool air of the between spaces, those transitional regions where the laws of one realm gradually gave way to the laws of another, where the familiar became unfamiliar by degrees so gradual that travelers might not notice the change until it was complete. The landscape through which he passed was neither the golden beauty of Asgard with its divine architecture and perfect illumination, nor the green fertility of Midgard with its forests and fields and abundance of growing things, but something more subtle and more complex, something that spoke to different aspects of consciousness, different needs of beings who had completed one phase of existence and were beginning another that operated according to different principles and different possibilities. Here grew trees whose leaves were silver gray, neither the vibrant green of living forests nor the brown and gold of autumn decay, but something that seemed to exist in a permanent state of beautiful transition, of elegant suspension between growth and rest, between the active metabolism of life and the peaceful stillness of completion. Their branches swayed to winds that carried not just air but something more complex, the whispered memories of countless lives lived and ended, the accumulated wisdom of beings who had discovered what lay beyond the boundary that separated temporal existence from whatever came after. These were not the harsh, cutting winds that brought storms and destruction, not the fierce gales that could uproot trees and level buildings, but gentle currents that moved with the patience of eternity, that carried within themselves the collected experiences of all who had made this journey before, all who had crossed from one state of being to another, and found that the crossing was not ending but transformation, not termination but translation into forms of existence that operated according to different rules, but were no less real, no less meaningful, no less connected to the ongoing story of consciousness, exploring its own possibilities. Flowers bloomed along the paths he walked, but these were not the bright, attention-demanding blossoms of mortal gardens, not the spectacular displays that competed for notice and proclaimed their beauty through vivid colors and dramatic forms. Instead, these flowers existed in colors that had no names among the living shades that spoke of twilight and contemplation, of peace that came only after struggle, of beauty that could be fully appreciated only when viewed from the perspective of completion, from the vantage point of beings who had experienced the full arc of existence and could now see patterns that were invisible to those still engaged in the process of living. Rivers flowed through this realm, but they carried more than water in their currents. These streams bore the accumulated weight of stories finished, love that had found its rest, dreams that had reached their natural conclusions, hopes that had either been fulfilled or had been released by those who had learned that some forms of satisfaction transcended the specific objects of desire, that some kinds of peace could be found only by letting go of attachment to particular outcomes. The sound these waters made was neither the cheerful babbling of mountain streams celebrating their liberation from ice and snow, nor the rushing power of great rivers carrying the accumulated flow of countless tributaries toward their oceanic destinations. Instead, it was something more like distant music, melodies that seemed familiar though no living ear had heard them before, harmonies that spoke directly to something deeper than conscious memory, rhythms that synchronized themselves with the fundamental pulse of existence itself. These river songs carried within them the voices of all who had ever lived. not as individual sounds that could be distinguished and identified, but as a vast chorus that had been blended by time and distance into something that was both completely collective and utterly personal, both universal and specific to each listener who encountered it. The music spoke of journeys completed, of questions answered, of love that had transcended the limitations of individual existence to become part of the larger symphony of consciousness exploring its own nature. As Baldur walked deeper into the realm of the dead, following paths that seemed to adjust themselves to his needs rather than requiring him to adapt to their predetermined courses, he passed others who had made this same journey, warriors whose battles were finally over, mothers whose children were safely grown, craftsmen whose masterworks were complete, scholars whose questions had found their answers, lovers whose devotion had been fulfilled or transformed into something that no longer required particular objects but had become a way of being that enhanced everything it touched. They looked upon him with wonder that was not surprise but recognition, the kind of amazement that comes when something expected but barely hoped for actually occurs, when theoretical possibilities become concrete realities, when the abstract becomes tangible in ways that exceed all reasonable expectations. Even in death, even in this realm where individual identity became more fluid and less insistent than it had been in life, his light persisted, not the warm golden radiance that had characterized his living presence, but something softer and more mysterious, something that had been transformed by the experience of crossing the ultimate boundary but not destroyed, not diminished, only changed into forms that were appropriate to this new environment. He greeted these fellow travelers with the same warmth he had shown to all beings in life, but now that warmth carried additional dimensions, additional layers of meaning, that came from shared understanding of what it meant to have completed the transition from one form of existence to another. His interactions with them were marked by a quality of recognition that went deeper than individual memory, that drew upon sources of knowledge that existed below the level where personal history was stored, in the spaces where consciousness touched its own fundamental nature. The conversations he had with these beings were unlike any he had experienced in life, not because they were more or less meaningful, but because they operated according to different principles, served different purposes, fulfilled different needs. In life, communication had often been about exchange of information, coordination of activities, expression of emotion, maintenance of relationship. Here, it served more as celebration of understanding, confirmation of connection, exploration of the deeper implications of existence that could only be perceived from the perspective of those who had completed at least one full cycle of embodied experience. These exchanges left him feeling not more isolated by the uniqueness of his situation, dying before his appointed time, arriving in this realm through circumstances that no one had anticipated, but more connected to the larger patterns that governed all existence, more aware of how individual stories fit into the greater narrative that encompassed all consciousness, all experience, all exploration of what it meant to be aware in a universe that seemed designed to foster and support such awareness. The great gates of Hell's Hall stood before him eventually, after a journey that had seemed both instantaneous and eternal, both effortless and profound, both simple transportation and fundamental transformation. These gates were massive constructions that seemed to be built from crystallized time itself, their surfaces not reflecting light in the normal manner, but rather holding and displaying moments, glimpses of lives lived, choices made, love given and received, wisdom gained through experience, beauty created and appreciated, connections formed between beings who had found in each other reflections of their own deepest nature. The gates were neither barriers designed to keep beings out, nor filters designed to admit only certain types of consciousness, but rather interfaces between different modes of existence, transition points, where the rules that governed life gradually gave way to the principles that operated in whatever came after life. They opened not with the grinding of metal or the creaking of wood, but with the soft susurrus of pages turning in some cosmic book, of chapters closing on stories that had reached their natural conclusions, of new sections beginning for tales that would continue in forms that their authors had not previously imagined. The sound they made was like the collective sigh of relief that comes when long-carried burdens are finally set down, when struggles that have consumed enormous energy finally reach resolution, when questions that have demanded years or decades or lifetimes of attention finally receive answers that satisfy not just the intellect but the heart, the soul, the entire being that had been engaged in seeking understanding. Beyond the gates lay the hall of Hell herself, a structure that defied easy description because it existed partially outside the normal laws that governed architecture and space, partially in dimensions that were not accessible to consciousness, still bound by the limitations of embodied existence, partially in territories that could only be understood through direct experience rather than through any form of second-hand description or intellectual analysis. It was vast as a mountain, and intimate as a hearthside, bright as noon and dim as twilight, depending on the needs and nature of those who looked upon it, depending on what each observer required for their own process of adjustment and understanding, depending on how much reality each consciousness could absorb without being overwhelmed by the magnitude of the transition they were undergoing. The structure seemed to adapt itself to its inhabitants and visitors, providing whatever environment would be most conducive to the processes of integration and transformation that marked this phase of existence. The walls seemed to be built from accumulated experience, not in any metaphorical sense but as literal construction material, as if the substance of the building itself had been created from the consolidated wisdom, love, struggle, growth, and understanding of all who had ever lived, all who had ever grappled with the fundamental questions of existence, all who had ever contributed something meaningful to the ongoing experiment of consciousness exploring its own possibilities through countless individual manifestations. The roof appeared to be constructed from gathered wisdom, from the distilled understanding that emerged when individual insights were combined and compared and allowed to interact with each other until they formed structures of comprehension that transcended what any single mind could achieve, that created frameworks for understanding reality that were more complete, more nuanced, more useful than the sum of their individual components. The floor was built from the solid foundation of accepted truth, not dogma or ideology or belief systems that required defense against challenge, but the kind of truth that emerges naturally from honest examination of experience, the kind of understanding that proves itself through its ability to provide guidance, to enhance life, to create connection between beings who might otherwise remain isolated in their individual perspectives and concerns. Hel herself received Baldur at the threshold of her hall, and her presence was as complex as the realm she governed, as multifaceted as the processes she oversaw, as paradoxical as death itself when viewed from the perspective of beings who had been trained to think of it as ending rather than transformation. Half living and half corpse, beautiful and terrible, young and ancient, she embodied the eternal paradox of death itself, not the violent ending that mortals feared, not the harsh termination that seemed to negate everything that had come before, but the natural conclusion that gave meaning to all beginnings, that provided context for all growth, that made possible the kinds of appreciation and understanding that could only emerge when viewed from the perspective of completion. Her voice, when she spoke to him, carried the echo of caverns deep beneath the earth, but also the warmth of hearth fires that had burned in countless homes throughout the ages of the world, the comfort of places where beings had gathered to share food and stories, and the simple pleasure of each other's company. It was a voice that had heard every possible confession, every form of regret, every expression of love, every attempt to understand what had happened in life and what it had meant and what lessons it contained that might be useful for whatever came next. Baldur Odinson, she spoke, her words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air of her hall was speaking, as if the architecture itself had learned language and was using it to welcome visitors and explain the nature of the place they had entered. You arrive here before your time was meant to be, before the natural conclusion of your earthly story, before the completion of whatever purpose your existence was intended to serve in the larger patterns that connect all beings. There was no accusation in her tone, no judgment of the forces that had brought him to her domain ahead of schedule, no criticism of the choices and circumstances and cosmic ironies that had resulted in his premature arrival. Instead, there was a kind of cosmic sadness, not personal grief but something larger and more impersonal, the regret that emerges when perfect patterns are disrupted by imperfect implementation, when beautiful designs are marred by the kinds of oversights and accidents and unintended consequences that seem to be inevitable features of any reality complex enough to support conscious beings. Even in this place of endings, she continued, her words carrying the weight of one who had observed countless transitions, who had presided over the transformation of countless individual consciousnesses from one form of existence to another, your presence speaks of disruption, of patterns altered before they reach their natural completion, of the natural order bent into shapes it was never meant to hold, at least not at this particular moment in the cosmic schedule. The statement was not complaint but observation, not criticism but recognition of the complex realities that governed existence in a universe where individual will and cosmic plan intersected in ways that sometimes produced harmony and sometimes created the kinds of complications that required adjustment, adaptation, creative solution finding that had not been part of the original design but became necessary when theoretical systems encountered the complexities of actual implementation. Baldur stood before her throne with the same gentle dignity he had shown in life, though now his light was muted, filtered through the laws that governed death itself, transformed by the experience of crossing the ultimate boundary from something that illuminated external space to something that seemed to emanate from depths that were internal, personal, individual rather than universal. The change was not diminishment but adaptation, not loss but transformation into forms that were appropriate to this new environment, this different phase of existence. When he spoke, his words carried neither complaint nor despair about the circumstances that had brought him here, nor resentment about the disruption of whatever plans might have governed his earthly existence, nor bitterness about the love that had tried to protect him and failed, but a quiet acceptance that spoke of wisdom gained through the profound transition he had undergone, understanding that emerged from direct experience of what it meant to move from one form of consciousness to another. "I am here, my lady," he said, his voice still warm despite the coolness of his new existence, still recognizably his own despite the changes that had been wrought by the experience of dying and being reborn into this different form of being, by the working of fate or chance or the complex intentions of beings whose motivations may be beyond even their own understanding, beyond even their own conscious awareness of what they were truly trying to accomplish through actions that seemed to have clear purposes but produced results that no one anticipated. The words carried no bitterness about Loki's role in his death, no anger about the oversight that had made his death possible, no resentment about the failure of comprehensive protection to provide actual comprehensive protection. Instead, they reflected a kind of philosophical acceptance, a recognition that existence operated according to principles that were larger and more complex than any individual consciousness could fully grasp, patterns that encompassed more variables than any finite mind could track, purposes that served goals too vast to be comprehended from the perspective of those who were embedded within the processes rather than observing them from some external vantage point. "I would learn what this means," he continued, his curiosity about his situation expressing itself not as demand for information, but as gentle inquiry, as the natural desire of consciousness to understand its circumstances, to find meaning in experience, to locate itself within whatever larger context might provide framework for making sense of what had occurred and what was occurring now, both for myself in terms of what form my existence will take in this new environment, or for the world I have left behind, which must now adapt to my absence and find ways to continue the work of existence without whatever contribution my presence was meant to make. The conversation that followed was unlike the passionate debates of Asgard where gods argued about policy and strategy and the best methods for maintaining cosmic order, unlike the fierce negotiations that typically accompanied times of crisis when urgent decisions needed to be made quickly, unlike the formal ceremonies that marked significant occasions with their ritualized exchanges and predetermined outcomes. Thoughtful exchange between two beings who understood that some questions had no simple answers, that some situations required exploration rather than immediate decision, that some forms of understanding could only emerge through patient conversation between consciousnesses that were willing to acknowledge complexity, to sit with uncertainty, to allow meaning to develop gradually through dialogue rather than demanding immediate clarity through the application of superior knowledge or authority. Hel spoke of the nature of death and life, of the delicate balance that maintained the boundary between the two states of being, of how that boundary was not a wall but a membrane, not a barrier but a transition zone, not a termination but a transformation that preserved what was essential while allowing what was temporary to be released. She explained how Baldur's presence in her realm before his proper time might affect the larger patterns that governed existence, might create ripples in the cosmic order that would require adjustment and adaptation by forces and beings throughout all the realms. "In the world of the living," she said, her words carrying the weight of eons of observation, the wisdom that came from having presided over countless transitions from life to whatever lay beyond life, "you were beloved for your light, your gentleness, your ability to bring peace to troubled hearts, harmony to conflicted situations, hope to those who had begun to despair of finding meaning in their existence." The description was accurate but incomplete, as all descriptions inevitably were when attempting to capture the full significance of any complex being, any consciousness that had developed through experience into something that transcended simple categorization or easy summary. She was acknowledging not just what he had been, but what he had represented. not just his individual characteristics but his function within the larger system of relationships and influences that constituted divine community and its effect on the broader cosmos. Here, in the realm of endings, she continued, those same qualities serve different purposes but retain their essential value, their fundamental capacity to enhance the experience of existence for other consciousnesses that encounter them. You bring comfort to souls who struggle with the finality of their transition, who have difficulty accepting that death is not punishment or failure but natural conclusion, appropriate completion of one phase of existence and beginning of whatever comes next. The explanation helped him understand that his death, while premature and tragic from the perspective of those who had loved him and depended on his presence, was becoming part of a larger pattern whose full implications were only beginning to emerge. His role in this new environment would be similar to what it had been in life, providing comfort, bringing peace, offering hope, but adapted to the needs of beings who were dealing with different challenges, different forms of confusion and uncertainty, different requirements for the kind of assistance he was uniquely qualified to provide. You offer hope to those who fear they have been forgotten by the living world, Hel explained. Reassurance that the bonds formed during embodied existence continue to operate even after the transition to this different form of consciousness. Evidence that love transcends the boundary between life and death, that meaning persists even when the forms through which it was originally expressed have been left behind. Baldur listened to these words with the patience of one who had learned that understanding came not through haste but through careful attention to nuance and implication, through willingness to sit with complexity rather than demanding immediate simplification, through recognition that some truths required time to be fully appreciated, required experience to be completely understood, required the kind of wisdom that could only be gained through direct engagement with the realities being discussed rather than through any form of second-hand description or intellectual analysis. He began to perceive that his death, while tragic from certain perspectives, while premature according to some cosmic schedules, while the result of oversight and accident rather than natural conclusion, was becoming part of a larger pattern whose full implications were only beginning to emerge. The disruption his early arrival had caused in the normal order of things was creating opportunities for new forms of understanding, new types of relationship between the living and the dead, new ways of thinking about the boundaries between different states of consciousness. His presence in Hel's realm was serving as a bridge between worlds, a connection point that allowed those who had completed their earthly existence to maintain contact with the ongoing story of life, to continue participating in the larger narrative of existence, even though their direct involvement in earthly affairs had ended. Through him, the dead could stay connected to the concerns and developments that affected their loved ones who remained in the world of the living, could continue to provide guidance and support and blessing, even from this different vantage point. Meanwhile, in the world of the living, grief moved through Asgard and beyond like slow poison, not the quick-acting toxin that kills immediately, but the kind that works gradually, systemically, changing the fundamental chemistry of existence in ways that might not be immediately apparent, but would eventually transform everything they touched. The loss of Baldur was not just the absence of one individual consciousness, but the removal of a stabilizing force, a source of harmony that had helped maintain the delicate balance between order and chaos, between hope and despair, between the forces that built and those that destroyed. Frigg wept tears that became pearls of ice when they touched the ground, each one a crystallized moment of pure sorrow that would never melt, never disappear, never stop reflecting whatever light was available to illuminate it. These were not ordinary tears but expressions of grief, so profound that they acquired physical form, so complete that they transcended the normal boundaries between internal experience and external manifestation, so pure that they became permanent additions to the landscape of sorrow that was spreading outward from the center of loss. Each pearl of frozen sorrow carried within it the complete story of a mother's love, the full narrative of hopes that had been nurtured from the moment of birth, dreams that had been carefully tended through ages of growth and development, plans that had been made with the confidence that comes from assuming the permanent presence of what is most precious. The tears contained not just sadness but the whole complex of emotions that accompanied the recognition that perfect love was not enough, that comprehensive care could still be incomplete, that even divine mothers could not protect their children from every possible harm. These crystallized sorrows became part of the physical structure of Asgard itself, embedded in the golden floors and walls like jewels set in precious metal, permanent reminders of what had been lost, ongoing testimonies to the kind of love that persisted even after its object had been removed. They served as focal points for meditation on the nature of attachment, on the relationship between caring and suffering, on the inevitability of loss in any universe where individual consciousness was possible, where beings could form connections that made their existence meaningful, but also made them vulnerable to the pain that accompanied the severing of those connections. Odin sat in his high throne Hlidskjalf in silence, so profound that even his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory themselves, dared not disturb it with their usual reports from their flights across the 9 realms. The All-Father's wisdom, vast though it was, accumulated through sacrifice and study and eons of careful observation, seemed suddenly inadequate to comprehend the new reality in which his most beloved son could be taken by forces he had not foreseen, could not prevent, and now struggled to accept as part of some larger pattern, whose meaning remained hidden from even his penetrating analysis. The ravens perched in uncomfortable silence on their accustomed places, their usual chatter stilled by recognition that their master was grappling with forms of knowledge that transcended information, wrestling with truths that could not be gathered through observation or study, but could only be understood through direct experience of loss, through personal engagement with the kinds of change that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality, and the possibility of maintaining what was most precious in the face of forces that seemed designed to take it away. The journey to Hel's realm required more than courage. It required the particular kind of madness that comes from love pressed beyond all reasonable limits. Hermod, Baldur's brother, volunteered for this impossible mission, riding Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir through paths that living beings were never meant to travel. The descent into the underworld was not the violent plunge of heroic tales, but rather a gradual sinking through layers of reality, each one dimmer and more hushed than the last. Hermod felt himself growing lighter as he traveled, as if approaching the realm of the dead required shedding more and more of his connection to life itself. When he finally stood before Hel's throne, with Baldur seated nearby in a place of honor among the departed, Hermod spoke not with the commanding voice of divine authority, but with the broken words of one brother pleading for another. Great Hel, all creation mourns for Baldur. Is there no way he might return to the light? Hel's response came slowly, as all important pronouncements in her realm did, weighted with the gravity of laws older than the gods themselves. Death is not easily undone, divine messenger, but love such as this, perhaps it deserves a chance. The condition she set was both simple and impossible. If all things in creation truly mourn for Baldur, if every being sheds tears for his loss, then death will release him. But if even one creature refuses to weep, he must remain in my halls until the end of all things. Hermod accepted the challenge without hesitation, though he understood the vastness of what was being asked. To find every created thing in all the 9 realms and ask for tears, it seemed both divinely necessary and humanly impossible. As he prepared to leave, Baldur approached him with the same gentle manner that had marked all his actions in life. "Brother," he said softly, "tell them that I am not unhappy here. Tell them that death, when it comes with purpose, brings its own kind of peace." But he also gave Hermod tokens to carry back, gifts that spoke of hope for return, of a belief that love might indeed prove stronger than the final boundary. The campaign to make all creation weep for Baldur began with the kind of systematic thoroughness that only desperate love can inspire. Hermod and the other gods spread across the 9 realms, carrying their plea to every corner of existence. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The elements themselves seemed eager to demonstrate their grief. Rain fell more gently, wind sighed through trees with audible sorrow, fire crackled with a sound like quiet sobbing, the very stones of the mountains wept mineral tears that became the first crystals. Animals large and small added their voices to the chorus of mourning. Wolves howled laments that carried across vast distances. Eagles cried out from mountain peaks. Even the smallest insects seemed to move with a heaviness that spoke of loss. Fish in the deepest oceans released streams of silver bubbles that rose like ascending prayers. Plants throughout all the realms bent their leaves in attitudes of grief. Flowers closed their petals as if unable to bear the full light of a world without Baldur. Trees shed leaves out of season, and grass grew pale as if drained of joy. Mushrooms in the deepest forests released spores that glimmered like unshed tears. Humans wept most readily of all, for they had always understood loss intimately. From the greatest kings to the smallest children, from warriors to poets, all added their tears to the growing flood of universal sorrow. Their grief was pure and uncomplicated, flowing from hearts that recognized the tragedy of light extinguished too soon. The giants, ancient enemies of the gods, surprised everyone by weeping openly. Their tears fell like rivers, carving new channels in the earth. Even the fire giants, beings of flame and fury, wept tears that hissed and steamed but fell nonetheless. As the weeping spread, it began to seem possible that the impossible condition might actually be met. The universe was demonstrating its love for Baldur in the most profound way imaginable, through the honest expression of grief at his loss. But in all the vast chorus of mourning that spread across the 9 realms, one voice remained silent. In a deep cave at the very edge of existence, the searchers found an ancient giantess whose eyes remained stubbornly dry. She called herself Thurk, and when the gods approached her with their desperate plea, she listened with the kind of stillness that suggests either deep consideration or complete indifference. Her form was bent with age, her face carved with lines that spoke of eons spent in solitude. "Weep for Baldur," she finally spoke, her voice like the scraping of stone on stone. "I never knew joy from him in life. Why should death bring me to tears? Let Hel keep what she has taken." The gods pleaded with her, explaining how all creation had shown its love through grief, how she alone stood between Baldur and his return to the light. They offered gifts, made promises, spoke of the greater good and the restoration of joy to the world. But Thuk remained unmoved, her eyes as dry as desert stones, her heart as closed as a door sealed with iron. "Each may weep as they choose," she said with finality. "I choose not to weep." As the truth of her refusal sank in, some of the gods began to suspect that this ancient giantess was not what she appeared to be. The shapeshifter's art was subtle, but there were those who had learned to recognize its signs. The way she held herself, the particular quality of her stubbornness, it all spoke of a familiar mind working behind an unfamiliar face. But proof was elusive, and time was short. Whether Thuk was truly an ancient giantess or something else entirely, her refusal was absolute and final. The condition had not been met. Baldur would remain in Hel's halls. The weeping of the world slowly faded, replaced by a deeper, more permanent sadness. The grief of hope denied, of love proven insufficient to overcome the ultimate boundary. With Baldur's fate sealed by a single refusal to weep, the world entered a period that would later be remembered as the beginning of its long slide toward ending. The light that had once warmed Asgard now existed only in memory, leaving the gods to navigate a dimmer reality. Odin, the All-Father, grew more withdrawn, spending long hours consulting his ravens and studying the runes that spoke of futures he could see but not change. The knowledge he gained was heavy with the weight of inevitability. Without Baldur's light, the forces of chaos would find it easier to work their will upon the world. Frigg retreated into a grief so profound that it became a kind of prayer, a constant communion with the memory of her lost son. She tended gardens where flowers bloomed in winter, maintaining spaces of beauty that seemed to exist in defiance of the world's growing darkness. Thor continued his battles against the giants, but his hammer fell with less joy than before. The thunder he commanded carried echoes of mourning, and his victories felt hollow without Baldur there to celebrate them with gentle words and warming light. The other gods each found their own ways to carry the burden of loss, but all of them moved through their daily tasks with the careful attention of those who understand that joy once lost may not return. In Midgard, the realm of humans, the change was subtler but no less real. Colors seemed slightly less vivid, music carried undertones of melancholy, and even the happiest celebrations were touched with the awareness that all things pass. The world had not ended, but it had aged in ways that could be felt if not seen, and in the halls of Hel, Baldur dwelled in dignity and peace, honored among the dead, waiting with infinite patience for the end of all things when his story and everyone else's would find its final resolution. The night grew softer around this knowledge, accepting what could not be changed. In the aftermath of Baldur's death, the gods faced a question that had no good answer: what to do with the one who had set these events in motion. Loki's fate became a matter of debate that divided even divine hearts. Some called for immediate punishment, their voices heavy with grief-fueled anger. Others urged caution, remembering that Loki's nature had always been complex, his actions often bringing unexpected benefits alongside their obvious costs. The shapeshifter himself remained largely silent, as if understanding that his words could only make things worse. The punishment, when it finally came, was designed not for revenge but for containment, a recognition that some forces, once set in motion, cannot be simply stopped but must instead be channeled away from further harm. Loki was bound in a cave deep beneath the earth, held fast by chains forged from the entrails of his own son, a consequence that spoke to the terrible complexity of divine justice. Above him was placed a serpent that would drip venom onto his face for all eternity or until the world's ending.
But even in this punishment, Love found a way to manifest. His wife, Sigyn, sat beside him with a bowl, catching the venom before it could fall, leaving his torment only when the bowl grew full and she had to empty it. The other gods returned to their halls and their duties, but the fabric of their community had been forever altered. Trust, once given freely, now came with reservations. Joy, once natural and abundant, now felt precious and fragile. They had learned that even in paradise, choices have consequences, and love cannot always prevent loss. Yet they continued, as gods and mortals alike must do, carrying their grief and their wisdom forward into whatever future awaited. The world still turned, seasons still changed, and life still found ways to assert its beauty, despite the shadows that had fallen. And somewhere in the deep places of the earth, bound but not broken, Loki waited for his own story's resolution. In the years that followed, years that stretched into centuries, centuries that became ages, ages that accumulated into the vast spans of time that only gods and stones can truly comprehend, the memory of Baldur's light became something more than nostalgia, something deeper than mere remembrance. It transformed into a living presence, a promise whispered in the wind, a hope that had learned to exist without immediate fulfillment, but had never learned to die.
The gods learned to speak of him not with the sharp pain of fresh grief that cuts like newly sharpened blades, but with the gentle sorrow of those who carry love for the departed as a permanent part of their being, woven so deeply into the fabric of their existence that it colored every experience, informed every decision, enriched every moment with the bittersweet awareness of what had been, and what was still cherished despite its absence. His name became a blessing in the halls of Asgard, invoked not to summon sorrow or reopen wounds that time had begun to heal, but to remember that beauty and goodness had once walked among them in perfect form, that the ideals they strived to embody were not impossible dreams but actual realities that had briefly graced their world with living presence. When the gods faced difficult decisions, they would sometimes pause and ask themselves what Baldur would have done, how his gentle wisdom might have found paths through moral complexities that seemed to offer only harsh choices between competing goods or necessary evils. His memory became a kind of moral compass, pointing not toward easy answers but toward the possibility that patient consideration might reveal solutions that honored both justice and compassion. Stories of Baldur spread throughout all the realms, passed from parent to child, from bard to audience, from teacher to student, each telling slightly different in its details but essentially true in its central message, that perfect goodness was not only possible but had actually existed, that the light which seemed so rare in a world of shadows had once burned with steady radiance in the heart of one who had loved all creation without reservation or condition. In these stories, his death became not just tragedy but transformation, the price paid for deeper wisdom, the darkness that made subsequent light more precious, the loss that taught those who remained to treasure what they still possessed while they possessed it. The tales wove his ending into larger patterns of meaning that helped their hearers understand how even the most painful losses could serve purposes beyond their immediate devastation. Children throughout the 9 realms grew up knowing his story, learning from it that gentleness was not weakness, that kindness was not naivety, that someone who chose to love all beings unconditionally was not foolish but wise in ways that surpassed ordinary understanding. His example became a kind of moral education that shaped generations of beings who had never seen his light but carried within themselves something of its influence. Artists found endless inspiration in his memory, creating works that captured not just his appearance but his essence, paintings that seemed to glow with internal light, sculptures that radiated peace even in their stillness, music that carried melodies of such beauty that listeners felt transported to realms where perfect harmony was not just possible but natural. These artistic interpretations of Baldur's life and meaning evolved over time, each generation of creators finding new ways to express the eternal themes that his story embodied. What remained constant was the sense that art created in his memory carried special power, special beauty, special ability to touch hearts and transform understanding in ways that other works, however skillfully executed, could not quite achieve. Prophets and seers, those rare beings gifted with sight that could penetrate the veils between present and future, began to speak of times beyond the end of the world, of ages that would dawn after the final darkness had run its course and given way to new forms of light. These were not just wishful dreams or comforting fantasies, but visions seen in the deepest meditative trances, glimpses of futures that lay beyond apocalypse, beyond the ending of all familiar things. In these prophetic glimpses, Baldur's return was central, not as the same god who had fallen to the mistletoe dart, but as something evolved, transformed by his journey through death into a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly alive, what it meant to love without reservation, what it meant to bring light into darkness, not through force but through the simple presence of perfect goodness. The seers spoke of him emerging from hell's halls, not marked by his time among the dead, but enriched by it, carrying within himself not just the gentle wisdom he had possessed in life, but also the profound knowledge that comes from having crossed the ultimate boundary and returned with stories of what lies beyond. His light, when it returned, would be not just warm but wise, not just beautiful but earned through suffering. These visions described a world that would rise from the ashes of the old, a new earth that would emerge from the waters of cosmic dissolution, green and fresh and full of possibilities that the previous creation had never imagined. It would be a place where the mistakes of the earlier ages had been corrected, where the tragic flaws that had led to loss and sorrow had been healed through the wisdom gained by experiencing their consequences. With him would come others, gods reborn, humans renewed, creatures recreated in forms that incorporated all the lessons learned through ages of struggle and growth and gradual understanding of what it truly meant to live in harmony with the deepest principles of existence. The new world would be paradise, not because it was free from challenge, but because its inhabitants had learned how to meet challenges without losing their essential goodness. In this vision of cosmic renewal, even the mistakes and sorrows of the first world found their purpose, revealed not as senseless tragedy, but as necessary education, as the price that had to be paid for the deeper wisdom that would guide the world's second creation. Baldur's death was shown to be not meaningless loss, but essential sacrifice. The darkness that had to be endured before dawn could break with full understanding of what light truly meant. These prophetic visions brought comfort to those who had lived through the long twilight that followed Baldur's death, but they also served a deeper purpose. They suggested that the current age of sorrow and limitation was not the final word on the cosmic story, that endings could become beginnings, that even the most complete seeming conclusions contained within themselves the seeds of new chapters. The prophecies spoke too of how all the gods who had seemed lost would find their places in the renewed creation, how even those who had made terrible mistakes would be offered opportunities for redemption, how the cosmic drama in which they all played parts was larger and more complex than any single age could contain. The story was bigger than anyone telling of it, richer than any single perspective could encompass, and Loki himself, released finally from his binding when the old world ended and the new one began, would find his place in the restored order, not as villain or hero, but as the necessary force of change and challenge that keeps perfection from becoming stagnation, that ensures growth continues even in paradise, that maintains the dynamic balance between order and creativity. These were the dreams that sustained the gods through the long twilight of their first existence, the hopes that made their losses bearable and their continued struggles meaningful. They carried within themselves the promise that everything they were experiencing, the joys and the sorrows, the victories and the defeats, the love and the loss, was part of a pattern too large for them to see clearly, but too important for any part of it to be meaningless. The memory of Baldur's light became the brightest star in this constellation of hope, the promise that goodness was not a temporary aberration in a universe trending toward darkness, but the essential nature of existence itself, temporarily obscured but never truly extinguished, waiting for the right conditions to shine forth again with even greater brilliance than before. In the deepest part of night, when the boundaries between memory and hope grew thin, when the distinction between what had been and what might yet be became less important than the eternal truth they both served, the gods would sometimes sense his presence still, not as a ghost clinging to the past but as a promise reaching back from the future, as a reminder that love, once given truly, becomes part of the fundamental structure of reality and can never be completely lost. These were the moments when the long twilight felt less like ending and more like intermission, less like conclusion and more like the pause between movements in a vast symphony, whose final themes were still being composed, still gathering the harmonic complexity necessary to resolve all the tensions and contradictions of existence into one perfect, eternal, utterly satisfying chord that would make all the waiting, all the suffering, all the patient endurance worthwhile. And in those moments, Baldur's light seemed not just remembered but present, not just cherished but active, not just mourned but celebrated, as if the future were reaching back through time to touch the present with the knowledge that endings are always also beginnings, that losses are always also transformations, that death is always also the doorway through which life passes to find its truer, deeper, more permanent forms of expression. The seers spoke of Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, the ending of all things, not as a final catastrophe but as a transformation, a necessary death that would precede a greater rebirth. And in all these prophecies Baldur's return was central, the light that would dawn after the longest darkness. They saw him emerging from Hell's halls not as the same god who had fallen to the mistletoe dart, but as something evolved, transformed by his journey through death into a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. His light, when it returned, would be not just warm but wise, not just beautiful but earned through suffering. With him would come others, gods reborn, humans renewed, a world scrubbed clean of the accumulated weight of ages of choice and consequence. The new earth would rise from the waters of chaos, green and fresh and full of possibility, a garden where tragedy might still exist but would not have the final word. In this vision of return, even the mistakes and sorrows of the first world found their purpose. Baldur's death was revealed not as senseless loss but as necessary sacrifice, the price that had to be paid for the deeper wisdom that would guide the world's second creation. And Loki himself, released finally from his binding, would find his place in the new order, not as villain or hero, but as the necessary force of change and challenge that keeps perfection from becoming stagnation. These were the dreams that sustained the gods through the long twilight of their first existence, the hopes that made their losses bearable and their continued struggles meaningful. The story itself seemed to rest here, gathering strength for its final transformation, and so the tale of Baldur finds its resting place, not in endings but in the space between sleeping and waking, between what was and what might yet be, between the last breath of one story and the first breath of the next. Like all the greatest stories, it continues even when the telling stops, living on in the quiet places of the heart where hope and memory intertwine like lovers' hands, where past and future meet in the eternal present of the dreaming mind. In the deepest part of night, when consciousness drifts between dreams like a small boat moving between islands of thought, the light of Baldur can still be felt, not as the blazing radiance of the sun that demands attention and burns away shadows, but as the gentle glow that guides travelers through darkness, the warmth that remains in stones after sunset, the first pale hint of dawn that promises morning even in the deepest winter, even in the longest night. His story becomes part of the greater dreaming of the world, woven into the fabric of sleep, where all possibilities exist simultaneously, where contradictions resolve themselves into deeper truths, where every ending is also a beginning, and every loss reveals itself to be also a transformation. Here, in the realm of dreams, he has never died, and is always dying, is eternally mourned and perpetually returning, is both the light that was lost and the light that will come again. The gods sleep now in their halls, their mighty forms at rest but their spirits wandering through landscapes of memory and prophecy, their dreams blending into the vast narrative that encompasses all tales ever told, all stories ever whispered, all hopes ever cherished in the dark hours when the waking world grows quiet, and the inner world comes alive with possibility. Their dreams merge with those of mortals. Their hopes become part of the deep currents that flow beneath waking consciousness like underground rivers carrying the promise that nothing truly beloved is ever completely lost, that every act of love leaves traces in the fabric of reality, that every moment of genuine beauty becomes part of the eternal treasury of experience that enriches all who come after. Frigg dreams of gardens where every flower blooms eternal, where the seasons turn but nothing ever truly dies, where her son's laughter echoes through air that has learned to hold on to joy like amber preserves the delicate forms of ancient life. Her dreams are filled with the colors of springtime that lasts forever, with the music of wind chimes made from crystallized tears that have been transformed by time and love into something more beautiful than sorrow. Odin's dreams are vast as the sky, filled with patterns that connect all stories into one great story, all lives into one great life, all endings into one great transformation. In his sleeping visions, he sees the threads that bind past to future, the web of causation that makes every choice echo through eternity, the deep structure that gives meaning to what often seems like random suffering or arbitrary joy. Thor dreams of peaceful strength, of power that protects rather than destroys, of thunder that brings rain for growing things rather than devastation for enemies. His sleeping mind wanders through landscapes where his mighty hammer has been transformed into a tool for building rather than battling, where his voice calls communities together in celebration rather than armies together for war. Even Loki, bound in his cave beneath the earth, dreams, and his dreams are perhaps the most complex of all, filled with shapes that shift and change, with questions that lead to other questions, with the bittersweet understanding that comes to those who have learned the true cost of their curiosity. His dreams are touched with regret, but also with hope, with sorrow but also with the deep satisfaction that comes from having played an essential part in a story larger than any individual understanding. And you, dear listener,
drift now on those same currents that carry the dreams of gods and mortals alike, becoming part of the great dreaming that keeps all stories alive, that preserves every moment of beauty, that holds safe every gesture of love until the time comes for it to bloom again in new forms, in new lives, in new ages, yet to be born from the fertile darkness of night, and sleep, and patient waiting. The breath grows slower now, deeper, more rhythmical, like the breathing of the earth itself, as it turns through its ancient cycles of day and night, season and season, age and age. The heartbeat quiets to match the rhythm of deeper pulses, the slow drumbeat of geological time, the vast respirations of stars being born and dying, the eternal dance of creation and dissolution and recreation that keeps the universe eternally young despite its infinite age. The boundary between self and story grows soft and permeable, like the edge between lake and shore, where water meets land so gently that it's impossible to say exactly where one ends and the other begins. Baldur's light dims to the gentle radiance that illuminates the landscape of dreams, not the harsh brightness that defines and separates, but the soft glow that unifies and embraces, that makes all boundaries seem less important than the connections that flow across them. In this liminal space between waking and sleeping, all the characters of the story become part of the dreamer's own experience. The gentle wisdom of Baldur, the protective love of Frigg, the searching intelligence of Odin, the loyal strength of Thor, all become aspects of the dreaming mind, facets of the complete consciousness that emerges when the barriers between self and other, between individual and universal, grow thin enough for deeper truths to shine through. The story of loss becomes a lullaby, the tale of sorrow becomes a song of comfort, the narrative of endings becomes a promise of beginnings yet to come. Each character's pain transforms into the dreamer's peace, each god's struggle becomes the sleeper's rest, each moment of mythic intensity becomes a gentle wave in the ocean of dreams that carries all stories, all hopes, all loves toward the shores of morning. The ancient words find their rhythm in the sleeper's breathing, the cosmic themes harmonize with the quiet music of blood moving through veins, of air moving through lungs, of thoughts moving through the vast spaces of consciousness like clouds moving across an infinite sky. The story becomes a living thing not separate from the listener but part of them, woven into their being like breath, like heartbeat, like the slow tide of sleep itself. And in this integration, this gentle absorption of story into soul, the tale finds its true completion, not in the reaching of a final destination, but in the becoming of a permanent part of the dreamer's inner landscape, a story that will live and grow and change with each telling, each remembering, each quiet moment when the mind returns to touch these images and themes and eternal truths. The gods settle deeper into their mythic sleep, their forms becoming part of the eternal dreaming that underlies all particular dreams, their stories joining the vast library of narrative that informs every human heart with knowledge of what it means to love, to lose, to hope, to endure, to find meaning in the face of mystery, beauty in the midst of sorrow, light in the heart of darkness. Baldur's presence becomes not something remembered but something constantly renewed, not a figure from the past but a quality of consciousness that exists in the eternal present of the sleeping mind, where all times are now, all stories are current, all loves are immediate, and real, and transforming. His light becomes the light of awareness itself, gentle and constant, and never truly extinguished, only sometimes hidden behind clouds that eventually pass, only sometimes dimmed by veils that eventually lift. The tale breathes with the rhythm of natural sleep, each image flowing into the next, like waves on a peaceful shore, each theme developing and resolving like movements in a vast symphony played at the tempo of rest, at the volume of whispers, in the key of dreams. The narrative becomes not something imposed from outside, but something arising from within, not a story told to the sleeper, but a story being told by the sleeper's own deepest wisdom. In the growing quiet, the distinction between storyteller and listener fades like the last light of evening, like the final notes of a lullaby, like the gentle transition from thinking to being that marks the passage from wakefulness into the deeper truths that can only be known in sleep. The voice that tells the story becomes the voice of sleep itself, the ancient wisdom that speaks in images rather than words, in feelings rather than thoughts, in the deep knowing that flows beneath the surface of conscious understanding. And so in quiet the tale rests, while you drift gently into sleep, carried by the ancient currents of myth and memory, held safe in the knowledge that some stories are so true they become part of the dreaming of the world itself, so beautiful they transform into lullabies, so gentle they become the very breath of rest. The night grows softer around this knowledge, embracing sleeper and story alike in the vast compassion that makes all things one, that dissolves all boundaries in the ocean of dreams, that carries every consciousness home to the peace that lies at the heart of all tales, all songs, all gentle drifting into the arms of sleep. The boundaries fade, the stories merge, and in the space between sleeping and sleeping deeper, all tales become one tale, and that tale becomes the gentle rhythm of breath itself, carrying you deeper into the peace that lies at the center of all stories, all dreams, all gentle surrender to the healing power of rest, and the story sleeps, and dreams and waits, breathing with the rhythm of the dreaming world, part of the eternal lullaby that sings all consciousness gently toward the dawn, when stories will wake transformed, when dreams will become memories, when the gentle wisdom of sleep will join hands with the bright energy of day to dance the eternal dance of being. The story rests, and in resting becomes part of you, becomes part of the great dreaming, becomes part of the gentle night that holds all tales, all hopes, all loves in its soft embrace until the time comes for awakening, for new stories, for the light that always returns, no matter how deep the darkness, no matter how long the night, and so in quiet the tale rests, while you drift gently into sleep,